All right, well, thank you, Jay. Thank you, John, for bringing me in. And also, I'd like to thank Laura Gurman, who was very helpful in arranging my trip here. So this talk, here I'll do the appropriate PowerPoint thing. This talk is part of a book in progress on the MP3 format. And you may think it's a long way from MP3s to torturing cats, but actually it's shorter than you think. Okay, let's start with some basic stuff. You know what, normally I'd ask, how many of you know what an MP3 is? Except that when I do that, no one will admit they don't. So let me just tell you, in case you don't know, an MP3 is a file format, just like on your word processor, you have doc files and RTF files. It's a sound file. And it's a historically important format because it was the format used in the boom of illegal file sharing on the internet, and also shadow economies of digital music that developed in the 1990s on the streets of places like Moscow and Mexico City. The deal with an MP3, if you have a song in MP3 format, it is considerably smaller in file size than the same song that you would have on a compact disc, which means it's easier to share MP3s, to trade them, to transmit them over internet lines, and to store them on hard drives, which is what makes them so useful. Now, a lot of people have written about the so-called impact of the MP3, which is fine and dandy, except that they sort of take the technology for granted. And among other things, a cultural historian of sound technology, I thought that was a strange and unfortunate thing to do. You know, if it's this historically important technology, where does it come from, and why is it important? So each MP3 file, the way it makes the song smaller, so to speak, on your hard drive is each MP3 is made with another program called an encoder, and the encoder has in it a mathematical model of human hearing response. In other words, the encoder says, you're probably not going to hear these frequencies anyway, so let's throw them out. And because it does that, and it does that 72 times a second, and because it does that reasonably effectively, that's why MP3s more or less sound like music when you listen to them. So the question then is, where do these ideas about human hearing that are literally written into the code of every MP3 file come from? That's where I come in. They come from a field called psychoacoustics. Psychoacoustics is the study of human auditory perception. And psychoacoustics is, to use a word from philosopher and historian of science Georges Canguilhem, it is in the true. In other words, psychoacoustics, when people cite it, when people talk about it, it is the discourse of hearing, it is the understanding of hearing, which people in engineering treat as if it is the truth. Now this is important because people in the humanities, generally when they talk about hearing, they draw on completely different discourses. They draw on continental philosophy, especially phenomenology. They draw on psychoanalysis instead of psychoacoustics, completely different and competing branch of psychology. And they draw on a particularly pernicious form of communication theory called orality and literacy theory that I won't get into here, but I critique unapologetically in the introduction to the Audible Past. So it turns out that there is no academic history of psychoacoustics other than old psychoacousticians writing tribute to other old psychoacousticians. And so that's what I began doing as part of this project, because one of the central arguments of the book is that there's no such thing as bare hearing or hearing in itself. Everything we know about the faculty of hearing and everything psychoacousticians know about the faculty of hearing now is based on the interaction between ears and media. So one of the things I'm trying to do is basically trace the history and development of a psychoacoustic subject. So today I'm going to consider a particularly gruesome episode in that larger story, which are a series of experiments by Ernest Glenn Wever and Charles W. Bray, done in 1929, published in 1930 in a variety of journals, where they wired a series of live cats into a telephone system. Now, the key point of the talk, which I'm going to give you up front before we start marching through this, is that cat ears aren't an accidental surrogate for human ears in the phone circuits you're about to see. Instead, they are tied to what I'm going to call the project of disenchanting hearing. Though the experiment that Weber and Bray did turned out to be faulty, and I'll talk about that as well, it was a major step towards the fusion of auditory psychology and information theory that was necessary for the development of digital audio and also central to the development of the phone system in the 20th century. And I'm going to say just a little bit about that just to give you a little more background. In 1910, J.P. Morgan, whom you've probably heard of, gained a controlling interest in a company called AT&T that was up and coming at the time. And Morgan hired a guy named Vail, who in turn looked at all their research operations and said, we should consolidate these. And so he did. And he put all of his researchers together in New York City and directed them to get into fundamental research on human hearing. And I have a quote here from an article published in 1922 called The Frequency Sensitivity of Normal Ears, which is the first article based on a lot of empirical research that tries to spell out the frequency range that human beings can hear. And this quote, I think, accurately summarizes the sense of engineers at Bell Labs from the 19-teens on. So, and I quote it, "It is important for the proper engineering of the telephone plant to know in absolute terms the sensitiveness of the ears of the average telephone user." In other words, the idea was, if you want to improve the telephone, you got to know something about human hearing, or there's no point, because you'll just be sort of wandering around in the dark. But what quickly happened was precisely the opposite. And by that I mean that the engineers at Bell very quickly turned the process on its head, and instead of saying, what's the most sort of acoustically faithful phone that we could reproduce, or that we could create, they said instead, what's the minimum number of frequencies we need to send down the phone line in order for people to understand the call on the other end? And you can even, a really stark example of this today is the difference between cell phones and landlines, which, as you know, cell phone bandwidth is even narrower than the bandwidth you have on a land telephone, which is why people sound even worse on cell phones than they do on regular handsets. Now, this is important because you have to think about what AT&T was in the 19-teens and 20s. It was an aspiring national monopoly. And the deal that they had cut with the US government was that their prices for phone service would be regulated in exchange for not having competitors. Well, if your prices are regulated and you're a large corporation and you want to make more money, how are you going to do it? You're going to try to get more out of your infrastructure, and you're going to try to squeeze more profit out of other areas of your business. And so what AT&T basically set about to do in the 19-teens, and this is, I think, the beginning point of a long trajectory that ends with the development of the MP3. What they set out to do was to find a way to incorporate their knowledge of users' life processes, the very process of hearing, into the way the phone system works. In other words, if our ears could do some of the work of the telephone for it, then the infrastructure didn't have to, and they could use more of the, they could get more capacity out of their infrastructure and make more money off of it. Okay, so that's the initial motivation behind that, and that's the sort of backdrop to the story that I'm going to tell today. Because in essence, what happens is that AT&T takes over auditory psychology, which was a tiny, underfunded field in universities until the 19-teens and 20s, and suddenly it explodes, and it's because AT&T is pouring all this money into basic research. Okay, so I give you, we're going to cut to the climax right away, Weber and Bray's cat telephone. This is a schematic diagram of it. This is a human ear. on the receiving end. This is the head of a cat. And this is the cat telephone. So basically what they did, they had two rooms. They had an operating room and a soundproof room. I'm going to say more about this later, but soundproof rooms were a huge deal in 1920s psychology. They were like cutting edge research technologies. So you have the receiver here, and Weber would speak into the microphone, or Weber would speak into the cat's ear, which was basically set up like a microphone. The ear would convert the sound into electrical signals on the cat's auditory nerve, which would then go through here. It would go through 60 feet of cable. These are walls, right? So that Bray, the other researcher, can't hear Weber over here. You've got an input transformer that matches the line voltage between the cat head voltage and the voltage needed for the amplifier. You run it through the amplifier, attenuator, that's a volume knob basically, out a speaker, receiver, and then that's Bray's ear, right? So the idea is Weber speaks into the cat's ear, Bray hears it come out the other end of the phone. With any questions on how the cat telephone works? It's just like a receiver, but with a cat in it. Okay. So, I'm going to start reading now a little bit. So just because this gets thick and detailed, and I have lots of quotes, because that's what you do. So, Weber and Bray were a bit astonished. The signals they picked up off the auditory nerve came through the telephone receiver as sound. Quote, speech was transmitted with great fidelity. Simple commands, counting and the like were easily received. Indeed, under good condition, the system was employed as a means of communication between the operating and soundproof rooms. Now, given the still prevailing theories of hearing at the time, which came from a guy named Hermann Helmholtz, and I won't say much about that, and given the prevailing accounts of nerve sensations, the researchers actually hadn't expected the nerve itself to transmit pulses that could be turned back into sound, but it appeared to do just that. Weber and Bray checked for all other possible explanations for the transmission of sound down the wire. They even killed the cat to make sure there was no mechanical transmission of the sound apart from the cat's nerve. And another quote, after the death of the animal, the response first diminished in intensity and then ceased. Weber and Bray's experiment thus illustrates the logical limit of the psychoacoustic subject. I told you I was sort of going off in search of that. A subject literally wired into the system to pass electrical signals between brain and machine. A subject whose brain signals can be calibrated and correlated to vibrations and other sound technologies or out in the world. The cat's ear was like a condenser microphone on the front end of the system. It needed power in the form of biological life to operate. Invented during World War I, condenser microphones were hailed as, and I quote, the most nearly perfect electroacoustical instrument in existence and the origin point of modern acoustics. The condenser mics used two charged diaphragms separated by a small air gap to turn sound into electricity. And unlike previous microphones, because they were charged, they required a power supply. When the power was cut, the sound would fade away slowly and then disappear. So as the sound faded from Weber and Bray's cat microphone, it demonstrated in the animal's death that life itself could power a phone or any other electroacoustic system, and that perhaps life itself already did power the telephone. Now, in theory anyway, sound reproduction technologies have always had a degree of interchangeability with human hearing. And this is a picture from my first book, The Audible Past. The whole first chapter basically follows this machine around. What you have here is a human middle ear that has been nailed to a wooden chassis. You're looking at the ear from the inside out. So they've removed this part. You know, it's like my right ear if you were looking through my head. This was designed to produce squiggly lines on a sheet of smoked glass. So a person would speak in here, it would in turn vibrate the ear. This is a small piece of hay, and then they put a piece of smoked glass here. Somebody would turn the crank. You can't really see the crank. And what you'd get is something that looks like a waveform diagram now, a squiggly series of lines. And Alexander Graham Bell was interested in that because he thought that it would be a way to teach deaf children to speak as if they could hear, right? Because he would speak into it, and then the idea that would be that the deaf child would speak into it and modulate his or her voice until the squiggly lines produced by the child matched the squiggly lines produced by Bell. Unfortunately, it didn't work. But this machine gave Bell the idea for the telephone, or so he says, because it showed that a very small diaphragm could turn sound into something else. And the full story of that is in the audible past, if you're curious. So the idea of ears and sound technologies is an old idea. But in Weber and Bray, the model of interchange between ears and machines extends from the middle ear. This was all based on the small bones in the eardrum. Extended from the middle ear into the inner ear. And this shift is paradigmatic because it literally places sound reproduction technology inside the mind's ear. To put a Zen tone to it, the telephone existed both inside and outside Weber and Bray's cat, and by extension, people. Now, before I go any further, it's worth understanding the error that Weber and Bray made, because actually what they thought they had discovered and thought they'd proved was something called the telephone theory of hearing, that said that the auditory nerve basically works exactly like a phone line, and that the vibrations or the variations in the electrical current on the auditory nerve vary in exactly the same way that the variations exactly the same way the current would vary on a phone line. That's what they thought. Unfortunately, they were wrong. And here's a picture of the middle ear, so I can talk about it a little bit, although I don't see the auditory nerve. Anyway, what they'd actually discovered was something else called cochlear microphonics. This is the cochlea. Inside the cochlea are tons of tiny little hairs that each give off a very, are responsive to different frequencies and actually give off sounds, and subsequent psychoacousticians have actually been able to record the sounds that come out of the ear. They're called otoacoustic emissions. And so other researchers basically tried to reproduce Weber and Bray's experiment and found that what they were getting was the noises off the cochlea and not off the auditory nerve, which it turns out doesn't fire nearly often enough to actually carry vibrations that would move in the same way that sound signals move. All right. So in the 1934 paper, a guy named Hallowell Davis, who's one of the really towering figures of 20th century psychoacoustics, and who basically got his start by critiquing Weber and Bray, he wrote that nerves are bad circuits for reproducing sounds, but that the cochlea is an excellent circuit for reproducing sound, much like a microphone. Davis and his collaborators' work on cochlear transmissions paved the way for a wide range of subsequent research, and cochlear microphonics are still important today. So while Davis and his people did challenge Weber and Bray's conclusions, they also continued down the same epistemological path where ears and media were interchangeable. In fact, one was best explained in terms of the other. Meanwhile, the brain's work of translation from firing neurons into the perception of sound became a major preoccupation of psychoacousticians as well, and remains something of an open question down to the present day. In other words, given that the auditory nerve isn't carrying signals that exactly mirror the fluctuations of sound, how does it get back into being the perception of sound in the brain? And there's a lot of debate about how that actually works. I'm also not going to talk about that. So it becomes even clearer how important Weber and Bray were if we consider their relationship to the cats in their experiments and contrast it with the longer history of auditory research conducted on cats. Brain researchers interested in hearing have long used cats as research subjects. The cat brain is structurally similar enough to the human brain to allow for useful comparison, and cats were relatively inexpensive to acquire and maintain in the lab in comparison with, for instance, monkeys. What sets Wever and Bray apart, and I'm going to hit this point again and again, you'll see, is that they don't actually address the cat. They use its ear as a microphone. But the cat's consciousness is never in question in Wever and Bray's experiment. Of course, the cat itself could not have been conscious per se, since its entire cerebral cortex and most of its midbrain had been removed, which makes earlier researchers' responses to their decerebrated cats all the more bizarre. Despite the absence of anything like cat consciousness in the decerebrated animals, researchers treated their decerebrated cats as, well, cats. For instance, a 1922 Bassett and Penfield article, and they're two doctors who experimented with removing parts of cats' brains. They stated that, and I quote, "The most effective sound was a small scratching noise, and an animal would often react promptly by raising its head if a piece of paper were crumpled up at a distance of 1 or 2 yards. These sounds are similar to those made by a mouse." Now, the cats are clearly not enjoying any kind of intersubjective relationship with the researchers. In fact, they weren't enjoying it at all. At no time did the researchers imagine anything approaching a relationship of communication or intersubjectivity with the live animals that they were cutting open. But the researchers did still think of their cats as, if you'll pardon the phrase, cat subjects. The researchers compared their decerebrated cats' responses and behaviors to those expected of regular cats. Bassett and Penfield's invocation of the similarity of their scratching and crumpled paper sounds to those made by a mouse as opposed to a squirrel or some other animal is a perfect example, because here the researchers are imagining their research cat as they would any other cat through the cliches of expected feline roles and interests. In fact, they were following the path set out by 2 other medical researchers, Forbes and Sherrington, who had developed the decerebration procedure. And I'm skipping a long quote from them. In their article, the decerebrated cat is explicitly compared to a healthy cat, and the entire study is based on the animal's own reactions to sounds. The cats are the object of researchers' communications, whether the researchers are imitating dogs and cats or lifting and replacing the cover on a canary's cage to control its singing in the lab. Forbes and Sherrington sought to get to the essential truths of hearing by treating their decerebrated cats as cats. In contrast, Wever and Bray treated their cats as microphones. Now, a few words ought to be said about the violence of the decerebration procedure and the status of the cats. Scientists in the early 20th century were no doubt aware of the moral questions surrounding experiments on animals. Anti-vivisection campaigns first developed in the mid-19th century, and though psychology would not become a major target of the movement until sometime later, it's still quite likely that scientists involved had some sensitivity to the ethical issues involved. By the 1930s, public debate about animal experimentation and its relation to experiments on people had been raging for decades. Bassett and Penfield's description of decerebration is most thorough, and they deal directly with the question of pain. And here's a quote. The Sherrington preparation seemed ideal, since the question of any conscious sensation would be completely excluded. And in addition, the preparation, that means the animal, would remain quiet during the experiment. Now, this makes it all the stranger that both teams of researchers, Forbes and Sherrington and Bassett and Penfield, spent some of their time barking like dogs, crumpling paper to simulate mice, yowling like cats, and either bringing birds into the lab or chirping like birds themselves. And I have this wonderful image of these sort of hyper-serious scientists in lab coats, like walking around with this damaged cat in a bath of warm water, because you had to keep the cats in water because the part of the brain that regulates temperature had been removed, you know, walking around and barking at them to see what they would do. Now, behind all this lies grand metaphysical questions about the seat of consciousness and subjecthood in the animal's brain and body, and specifically the researchers' answers to those questions. Right? Why did the researchers write about this surgical procedure as if it left the animal with no consciousness, and then approach the animal as if it had some vestigial consciousness in their subsequent experiment? The simple answer is that they were trying to solve a problem. In the studies of decerebration for the purposes of hearing research, authors didn't know where auditory perception took place, and so they were doing their best to ascertain how much of audition was left when the mind was gone. But a deeper answer might still lie in the ambiguous social status of the animal as it lay on the surgical table, or afterwards as it lay in a bath of warm water. If you were to teleport back in time and ask the researchers why they used cats, their answers would probably have the ring of common sense and scientific reason. Cats were cheap, convenient, similar enough to people, and pliable for the experiment. They were more or less interchangeable with other animals. And in fact, there's this whole discourse of animals of convenience in the history of psychological research. So there's this famous story about George von Bekeschi, who's the only person, I think, to win a Nobel Prize for auditory research. Bekeschi was really interested in the workings of the cochlea, but this is a very, very small organ, and it's also very fragile, so it's made of bone, and if you break it open, then the whole thing sort of shatters. So my favorite George Bekeschi quote is, "By good fortune, the head of an adult elephant became available for study." And indeed, Bekeschi, an elephant in the local zoo, died, and so Bekeschi sent one of his research assistants to go off and get the cochleas out of this elephant so that he could study them, because they'd be finally, really big enough to see what a mammal's cochlea is like. And in fact, the research assistant had to make 3 separate trips, because first he went to the zoo. The elephant had already been sent to the glue factory. So then he came back. Then he went to the glue factory. But his first cut wasn't deep enough, and he didn't get the cochlea, so he had to go back a 3rd time in order to get the elephant. So there's this whole discourse of animals of convenience, but I don't think that's the whole story. Because beyond the stated intentions of the decerebrators and their presentation of disinterest as to the significance of the animals they used, we should ask what difference it made that cats figure so prominently in this tale, and you'll see they keep coming up again and again. As cultural historian Robert Darnton writes in his famous essay called The Great Cat Massacre, there's a certain je ne sais quoi about cats. In many cultures, cats straddle animal categories. In the decades before they became subjects of decerebration, cats were used for their mousing skills and their companionship, but they were also routinely tortured and killed, sometimes eaten, often because they were thought to have magical powers in both life and death, for fertility, for luck, for power, or for protection. Indeed, an earlier chapter in the history of acoustics follows this logic, and this is a device called the cat piano, which works by driving spikes into these trapped cats' tails, and then of course they let out a yowl, and you can see the yowling cats. So, Kircher built his cat piano around 1650, and it was designed to amuse a bored Italian prince. This particularly cruel instrument shows up again in 1725 when Louis Bertrand Castel announces his ocular harpsichord. Castel used the cat piano as a joke to show that the sounds were not beautiful in themselves, but could only be made so through sequence and harmony, and ultimately human will. In a subsequent series of letters, Castel argued that music was something one learned to appreciate, and that it was a purely human faculty. So the cat piano showed that there's no such thing as cat music, only human music made through tormented feline cries. Now, 2 centuries later, the tables would turn as the inquiry moved from thought to perception. Cat consciousness was to some extent interchangeable with human perception for our psychoacoustic researchers, or for that matter, electromechanical transmission. So while there may be no cat music, there is cat music transmission. So if there's any historical relationship between the kinds of cat torture and murder one might find in a cat piano or in the essay that Robert Darnton wrote on cat massacres. If there's any relationship between that and the cold, humane vivisection of the physiologists and psychologists who I'm writing about, it's through a relation of cultural descent. Max Weber described the pursuit of wealth as losing its dimension of religious calling and becoming an empty activity in itself over the 19th century. One might say the same thing about people killing cats. The decerebrated cats were unfortunate occupants of what Weber called modernity's iron cage. Stripped of their magic and mystique, they were still killed for human access to their powers. If there's a path from cat massacres to scientific study, it is a path of Weberian disenchantment. So one of the ways to understand decerebration is precisely as a kind of disenchantment of both cats and the process of hearing itself. For Claude Bernard, a pioneer in using vivisection for physiological research, it was very much about the ceremonial disenchantment of the body, the admixture of inside and outside, and a revealing of previously hidden processes. Though considerably less grandiose in their language, the decerebrators were part of the same intellectual trajectory. Now again, Weber and Bray differ from the decerebrators that came before them because they treat their cats as anything but cats. Their cats were microphones, transducers, and transformers for the simple telephone system they'd rigged up in the lab and the soundproof room. They remained category violators, but in a thoroughly modern way. And so let's go back to that circuit diagram. There it is. The cat head at the upper left is simply a part of a larger telephone system. In contrast to the human ear hanging off the end of the system in the soundproof room, the cat head is literally built into the system as a vital component. Now there's more than a little bit of Alexander Graham Bell and Thomas Watson mythology in the story of the experiment. I haven't been able to find a record of the words spoken into the phone, but you can easily imagine, "Bray, come here, I want to see you." Two researchers separated by a hallway. One was situated in a room where no outside sound could reach unless it came through the phone. The sound that came out of the speaker rendered the cat head just another node in the circuit. As Henning Schmidgen writes of soundproof rooms, they're not simply or primarily acoustic technologies. Rather, they're social technologies designed for particular configurations of researchers and research subjects. Soundproof rooms accommodate, and I quote from Henning, "a many-headed human and animal subject that's in the process of dissolution, and which, by means of accelerations and decelerations, by movements in place, continually recreates anew the borders between the inside and the outside." In this case, the soundproof room and the phone circuit crystallized the relationship between modern ears and the phone system. A set of ideas had been brewing for over a decade, was made brutally literal in Weber and Bray's experiment. With the correct transformer in place, the ear was a component of the phone system, not its object. AT&T had sought to find a way to incorporate the capacities of its users' hearing into its infrastructure. Here, a being's hearing is literally incorporated into the telephone circuit. The combination of a phone circuit and a soundproof room in this image renders concrete the institutional arrangements behind the collapse of ears and media. Soundproof rooms were a laboratory fractal through which modern psychological research emerged. First through the desire to isolate subjects in time reaction studies, and only later for the purposes of psychoacousticians. Soundproof rooms were a logical extension of the scientific aspirations of 20th century psychologists. If their goal was to study a particular subject's reaction to a particular stimulus, it only made sense to isolate the subject from as many other stimuli as possible. By 1929, when Weber and Bray made use of one of the Princeton soundproof rooms, the camera silencia, as Henning calls it, was a hallmark of the modern psychological laboratory because it was understood as a means to effect the level of isolation necessary for scientific observation of subjects. The installation of a phone system was also not accidental. As Mara Mills writes, Weber and Bray got their phone system, audiometer, and loudspeaker, and other equipment as well, on loan directly from Weigel and Lane, two Bell Labs researchers who conducted the first major quantitative study of a phenomenon called masking that I discuss elsewhere in the book, but won't get into here. This was the first such installation in North America, and as Mills explains, this relationship between Bell Labs and Princeton Psychology Lab facilitated the emergence of modern psychoacoustics. Indeed, Weber and Bray's own diagram partakes of the iconography of telephone circuits developed at Bell Labs. So compare this diagram with the image of a phone circuit in an article in the Fletcher and Weigel article I quoted from 1922 on normal hearing. If you read it anachronistically and inappropriately, you could imagine that Weber and Bray's circuit simply replaces the vacuum tube oscillator with the psychologist's voice and the space between the exciting receiver and capacity transmitter with the cat's head, right? So here's the voice, and here's where the cat head would go. If that's not enough, Fletcher and Weigel also explained the role of soundproof rooms in this process, and I quote, "It is extremely important that all noise interference be eliminated in making measurements near the threshold of audibility. In a room having the ordinary noises from the street, the threshold point may be shifted to 10 times its value in a quiet place, and in very noisy places, this may be increased to 1,000 times. Thus, the assembly of a cat, 2 psychoacousticians, a phone system, a loudspeaker, and a soundproof room crystallized the institutional and epistemological interconnection of early 20th century psychology, the phone industry, and architectural practice. This heady mix nourished the soil beneath our contemporary blend of ears and technologies in music, sound media, communication industries, and human sciences." All right, how am I doing on time? I'm doing all right. So the cats in this study, in addition to being model phone systems, were also model brains. The cats, in a way, stood in for people and for the faculty of hearing as such. Weber and Bray were clear on the matter. The cat was selected as a suitable animal for this investigation. It stands fairly high on the animal scale, and we have casual and experimental evidence indicating its hearing to be comparable to that of man, unquote. They were not the first to reach this conclusion. In his discussion of the telephone theory of hearing, the unfortunately named Edwin G. Boring suggested their experimental approach right on down to Weber's study of cat hearing that immediately preceded his work with Bray. Now, Boring was primarily interested in human hearing. The cat was merely an example, a detour from the main event, the human brain and the human mind. If that weren't enough, more than one of the decerebration studies made note of the fact that a human baby was born without a cerebral cortex and that was subjected to a few tests, but it was really unfortunate that they didn't have their own human baby without a cerebral cortex to experiment on. I'm extrapolating a little bit. So what would it mean to take the psychologists at their word that the cats were nothing more than stand-ins for people in these experiments? The substitutionist logic in Boring and Weber and Bray's writing and the work of the decerebrators before them suggests a warrant for doing so. And the answer really is a quote from John Durham Peters, which is that the condition of animals has long served as a political allegory for the treatment of humans. Consider the condition of the head itself. After opening up the skull and severing the connection between the upper and lower parts of the brain, the, and I quote, active electrode, usually in the form of a small copper hook, was placed around the nerve, while an inactive electrode was placed elsewhere on the body, in most cases on the severed cerebral tissue or on the muscle of the neck. In most experiments, the left pinna, the pinna is the part of the ear that you normally think of as an ear. Where am I? In most experiments, the left pinna was removed and a rubber tube sewed into the external skin. The tube led to a funnel into which the stimulating sounds were delivered. A close-up of the cat head in their telephone diagram renders the scenario quite clearly. Now think about this. A telephone wired directly into the brain, a mouthpiece with a tube sewed directly into the head. What a perfectly coercive model of propaganda. Here's a head physically connected to a communication system from which it cannot disengage itself and which it cannot turn off. Certainly, Weber and Bray were working in the point-to-point world of telephony and had completely discounted the cat's consciousness, and so perhaps this sounds a little bit extreme or far-fetched. The implication of this arrangement for mass media like radio or film were already being drawn out by Weber and Bray's contemporaries in social psychology and other related fields. The famous 1929 to 32 Pain Fund studies sought to apprehend the effects of movie watching on their audience, especially children, while radio researchers were probing the same questions for their medium in the service of advertisers. Regardless of whether the motivation was social reform or more effective advertising and public relations, media were conceived in this age in terms of their effects on users and audience, and those effects were considered to be substantial and direct. Now, of course, later researchers deride this paradigm as the so-called hypodermic needle effects model, as in they're criticizing it as saying that these early researchers imagined media as basically a needle you'd stick in somebody's arm and inject the content, like it worked that way. But the fantasy remains, of course, a powerful cultural script, and it gets replayed throughout the 20th century around comic books, television, video games, and most recently social networking software. Most importantly for our purpose, this hypodermic model also conceives of communication as primarily a function of transmission, an assumption it would share with the then emergent metascience of cybernetics. It's perhaps too obvious to cast the cat head as something of a cyborg, a cybernetic organism, a creature of social reality as well as a creature of fiction. We're not exactly fiction, as it turns out. The fusion of cats and communications theories, communication systems, appears as a recurrent theme in cybernetic thought. A robot cat is the case in point in a famous essay called Behavior, Purpose, and Teleology. And the physical fusion of cats and communication systems would be tried again in 1967 in the CIA's fatally ill-fated Operation Acoustic Kitty, in which they surgically inserted a series of microphones and radio transmitters into cats. The CIA researchers came to the conclusion that while cats could be trained to move short distances, this is a great quote, the environmental and security factors in using this technique in a real foreign situation force us to conclude that for our intelligence purposes, it would not be practical. And perhaps the agents were convinced of this when the CIA's first and probably only trained feline spy was run over by a taxi early in its first mission. So there's some reason to consider that Weber and Bray's cat head is an early iteration of cybernetic thinking that became so fashionable later in the century and so central to packet switching and other technologies, crucial to the development of the internet. And I should say a few things about what cybernetics is, because I actually define it earlier in the book, but I haven't in my talk today. So cybernetics was basically the science of command and control. And cyberneticians were interested in the way that people and machines would interact. And often what they did, they talked in this sort of bizarre language where people and machines were in fact equivalent. Now cybernetics, the normal story of cybernetics is that it emerged out of research in World War II. Basically what they were trying to do is predict trajectories for anti-aircraft guns. So how can you project the interaction of fighter pilots and their planes? And how can you predict that in such a way that you can then shoot them down? And that was sort of the empirical question that then led to a whole wide range of research after the Second World War. But what I found in digging into this a little bit is that that work itself depended on research that was done in Bell Labs in the 1920s. And I'm not going to get into that today, except to say that AT&T was basically developing early versions of cybernetics at the same time that they were developing psychoacoustics for, again, the same purpose of cramming more signal into phone lines and thereby making more money off of their infrastructure. So, here we go. So cybernetics conceived of human and mechanical signal processing as roughly analogous. And I have a quote from Norbert Wiener from his book, The Human Use of Human Beings, that was published in 1954. And he's talking about the brain and nervous system as signal processing devices. And what is his example? But a kitten, a cute, cuddly kitten. And so he says, I call to the kitten and it looks up. I have sent it a message, which it has received by its sensory organs and which it registers in action. The kitten is hungry and lets out a pitiful wail. This time it is the sender of a message. The kitten bats at a swinging spool. The spool swings to its left and the kitten catches it with its left paw. This time, messages of a very complicated nature are both sent and received within the kitten's own nervous system. In other words, the kitten is basically this huge electrical communication system analogous to something like the telephone. So while the kitten's consciousness is mysterious and inaccessible to Wiener, so are the signals in its nervous system, calibrated as they are to the animal's digestive system and the movement of a swinging spool of yarn. Despite the electronic language of circuits and messages, Wiener is not saying the kitten is a machine, though I always imagine it as a machine when I read this passage. He's saying that the distinction between a kitten and a machine does not matter for the theory of communication in cybernetics. And therein lies a line of descent from Weber and Bray to cybernetics. A cat is a phone is a cat, and a message is a message is a message. Now, there's much more to this story, but I want to skip forward for your benefit to the end. And here's another logo. This for an ill-fated company called Napster.com, which was, of course, the first killer application for internet file sharing. And what do we have here but a cat with headphones? A green-eyed cat with a sly smile listening to headphones. The Napster.com logo stares back. Called the Kitty Head by Napster executives, this is a second version of a logo designed by a friend of Napster founder Sean Fanning. Fanning chose it simply because, quote, it looks really cool. The manager of a branding firm, though, puts it in more conventional market speak. I love this. It's challenging and aggressive. It says, we're the underdog. It's a cat. We're the underdog, but we're the new kid on the block, and we are anti-establishment. Who really can tell a cat what to do anyway? So here's a picture of a cat connected to a sound system that's supposed to be a hallmark of agency for both the company and the consumer, and rebellion. And yet, it bears an uncanny resemblance to Weber and Bray's cat head. Unconscious, decerebrated, wired and sewn into a system that it cannot comprehend or choose to leave. Of course, the kitty head is both everything Napster says it is and a reminder of the violence in the Weber and Bray diagram. In either scenario, we see beneath the visual metaphor of a cat with headphones the homology of interior and exterior systems. Rebellious cats, rebellious listeners, communication networks, neural pathways. The homology between micro and macro is already presupposed, and the fundamental question of what it means to listen is already settled. However you read the kitty head, listening is above all else about one's position in the world of media, and an attempt to negotiate it. It is about the balance among phenomena of administration and exchange, and the place of listening in that configuration. There is no outside the system, at least not for these cats, because media are always already inside them. Thank you.